Hey everyone, gonna be having a few drinks with this video because this is something that's been on my mind for a long time, and I've wanted to make something about this topic for a while, but I've never really had the medium for it until this channel became a thing, so I guess you're getting the video. I want to be upfront about the nature of this video here. There are going to be things that I say that aren't going to be pleasant to hear. In fact, it may cause quite a bit of discomfort to confront the scale of how badly we fucked it on climate change. So this isn't going to be a video with too many gags in it, but I will try my very, very best not to make anyone fall into despair on this topic, because we do have options. They're just going to require us shaking out of a few basic assumptions about how much our personal activity matters. There are going to be timestamps in this video because I will be doing a slightly science-ish bit as the first section, partially because I think it would be nice for me to go back to my roots and do a bit of physics for you all, and also because it's important to understand the cause and effect at play here. I will be making some references to what I say in the first section throughout, but if you want to skip it, you can. I won't be offended. Well, I might be a little bit offended. And I've written this to make sure that you can follow along whether you watch that section or not. I'm also going to be upfront again and tell you what this video isn't. It's not an exploration or a debunking of climate change denial. I think there's plenty of material out there that does a better job than I ever could of exploring that and debunking it. H-Bomber Guy's video is one that springs to mind, as well as John Duncan's video on the topic, which I'll be using as a jumping off point about certain forms of denialism and how they contributed to us getting to the position we're in. There's also the recent video by my friend Ponderful, which is also good. I highly recommend all of those videos to you. But with all of that out of the way, let's get started. I made this way too strong. Way too strong.
Climate change, greenhouse gases, and the science bit.
Let's start with a simple definition. Climate change is the observed long-term changes in the average temperature of the Earth and of global and regional climate patterns as a result of this change in temperature. Before anyone decides to get clever in the replies, no, climate is not weather. Weather is what's happening outside of my window right now. We have an unfortunate amount of it in this country usually, but today is really nice, which is why I've got the drink and the shirt. Climate is long-term patterns that include weather conditions. So you can in fact have snow happen in July and there still be climate change, because those are two different things. Here's an interesting fact for you all. If you calculated what the temperature of a planet the size of the Earth orbiting our sun at the same distance should be using the Stefan Boltzmann law, okay, physicists, I'm going to need you all to relax and cover your ears while I do this bit, you'd find that the temperature of the Earth should be around 255 Kelvin or minus 18 degrees. So the average temperature is actually below the freezing point of water, and we should all be dead. So, I guess that's the video. If you enjoyed this, like and subscribe, I guess, and go join my Patreon. Okay, I'm just kidding. We're obviously alive, but how? Joseph Fourier, of Fourier Transform and being part of Napoleon's expedition to Egypt fame, I guess physicists and mathematicians just did more things back then, did a similar calculation and tried to propose a number of solutions as to how the real temperature could be so different from the calculated one. Fourier proposed that the Earth's atmosphere might have the properties of an insulator, not unlike a greenhouse, though Fourier never called it the greenhouse effect. That term emerged much later. The term greenhouse gas was possibly related to an experiment Fourier referred to by Horace Benedict de Saussure, involving a vase which had black cork all over the inside of it with panes of glass placed at intervals to allow the midday sun to heat these discrete areas. It turned out the more panes of glass that were between each section in the wider atmosphere, the warmer it was. So Fourier used this as the basis for his idea that the atmosphere may behave like the glass panes or like a greenhouse. We now have an idea that the atmosphere acts as an insulator, but the atmosphere has a lot of things in it. Nitrogen, oxygen, water vapor, carbon dioxide, even some argon. It stands to reason that not every single one of these could be creating a greenhouse effect. But which ones are? The earliest experiment I could find was one by Eunice Newton-Foote, who presented her findings in 1856. She decided to fill 3 containers up with different gases or mixtures of gases. She had one with water vapor, one with carbon dioxide, and one with the regular atmosphere. She found that
the highest effect of the sun's rays I have found to be in carbonic acid gas.
Carbonic acid gas is just the old-timey term that they used for carbon dioxide. So Eunice Newton-Foote is probably the first person to have provided experimental evidence that water vapor and carbon dioxide are greenhouse gases. The credit for this discovery is often given to Irish physicist John Tyndall, who explicitly cited and built upon the work done by de Saussure and Fourier. And it's curious that Foote's work wasn't really taken up by other scientists. I wonder what that was about. John Tyndall also probably had a bit more flair, with this quote concluding his work specifically about water vapor.
This aqueous vapour is a blanket more necessary to the vegetable life of England than clothing is to man.
So, for better or worse, his work is the foundation of our modern understanding of the greenhouse effect. There's one other greenhouse gas that will be relevant later, certainly as we progress through the century, which Tyndall somewhat hints at in his work with the idea of stronger hydrocarbon vapours. But because methane existed in such low quantities in the atmosphere, it was ignored. And if you want to have a guess at how this is going to progress, it was ignored is going to be a recurring theme. So you might be hearing it a lot in this video. So we now understand that specific components of the atmosphere act as insulators or greenhouse gases. I suppose for completion I should explain exactly how that works. The atmosphere absorbs a lot of the radiation that comes from the sun. What happens when this radiation is absorbed? Well, it depends on the molecule and which particular frequency of radiation is being absorbed. But in our case, the radiation that matters is infrared radiation, which you'll probably relate to heat because of wildlife shows with infrared cameras. And once again, physicists, you're going to have to cover your ears real quick. For the purposes of this explanation, yes, it's basically heat radiation. Even though any frequency of radiation will heat a surface or body like the Earth. Why does infrared specifically matter? Well, it's because the Earth itself is an emitter of radiation, and it emits radiation primarily that lies in the infrared range, which is being trapped by the greenhouse effect. Basically, greenhouse gases make it harder for the energy that reaches the surface of the Earth to be emitted back into space, adding energy to the system that is the Earth's atmosphere. In fact, as an emitter increases in temperature, the intensity of the radiation it emits increases. If this sounds like it could lead to something catastrophic like a feedback loop, well, I would simply point to our celestial twin Venus if you want a preview of what that future looks like in the long run. The fact that CO2 has the property of being a significant absorber of infrared radiation has been known since at least 1900, when Knut Angstrom, yes, that Angstrom is named after him, concluded that even at the very small concentrations that CO2 is found in our atmosphere, it is a strong absorber of infrared in our atmosphere. In fact, 4 years earlier, Swedish chemist, physicist, he was kind of both, and he kind of helped make physical chemistry, be a thing. But it was Svante Arrhenius who developed a model in an attempt to explain the cycle of ice ages followed by not ice ages that attempted to explain the relationship between CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere and temperature. To quote him, if the quantity of carbonic acid increases in geometric progression, the augmentation of the temperature will increase nearly in arithmetic progression. Basically, one line goes up, the other line goes up. Then, much like the emissions, things progressed from there. By 1938, we had data indicating that the temperature had increased over the past century, which was dismissed at the time. In 1955, computational models indicated that the doubling of CO2 concentrations would lead to a 3 to 4 degrees Celsius temperature rise. In 1957, the prevailing assumption that the ocean would absorb excess CO2 was debunked. By 1975, the term global warming was used on the title of a scientific paper, and by the 80s, the issue of climate change had become a political issue, for reasons we'll get into later. So it stands to reason, given our understanding of the way things like CO2 behave in the atmosphere, that adding more of it to the atmosphere than we can remove might lead to a change in the average temperature of the Earth, or a change in the climate change. We have quite a sophisticated grip on how all of this works, which is actually a point in our favor, interestingly. So if we have all of this information, and have had it for as long as we have, how exactly did we get here? And how bad is the situation we're in today? The short answer is going to be, we ignored it and it's very bad. But let's look at the longer answer.
How did we get here?
Alright, sorry everyone, had to refresh my drink real quick. Cheers, number 2. I did it too strong again. Okay everyone, so that's the science heavy section done now. We can relax. We're going to be doing mostly lighter history, a little bit of politics, and maybe 1 or 2 graphs, but nothing too stressful. When we say climate change, something that springs into my mind is the question, what is it we're changing from? There's an implication in that term, right? That there's a natural set of states that our climate exists within. When the IPCC report, which partially pushed me to make this video at last, says 1.5 degrees Celsius warning, it's comparing it to a reference temperature we call pre-industrial, based on the temperature between 1850 and 1900. Probably because it's before the change in concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere really started getting to the level that would fuck things up. We have ways of estimating the historic levels of CO2 and the temperature of the planet. Generally, we find that there are 2 natural levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we move between glacial and interglacial periods. Not to spoil where we're going in this section, but here's a graph that shows the ice core data for the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere compared to the observed atmospheric data after 1958. So yeah, I guess we're going to be finding out whether the Earth has a 3rd stable climate position. I can't wait to figure that one out. We had a pivotal series of events that changed the trajectory of humanity forever. The Industrial Revolution, which saw the rise of the use of coal for a whole host of things, but coal is, unfortunately for us, a non-renewable energy source that releases CO2 into our atmosphere. So you get a whole bunch of nice new consumer goods, and you can travel around the country, if you're rich enough, on these strange things, but all because some poor fucker has to dig ancient trees out of the earth so we can burn it. Now, in fairness, at the time, this probably didn't alarm people, since the Industrial Revolution began before anyone had really made any serious experimental observations about what changing the atmosphere might do to our environment. Also, let's be honest, manufactured goods kind of rule. And imagine if you went from everything being homemade and expensive to things being available that are affordable. Less unique, sure, but affordable. In case you can't tell, I'm not going to be making an ANPRIM argument here, if only because the ANPRIM argument necessarily means that only 5,000-ish people could really live in the UK, and there are a few more people than that currently living here. And to be honest, I don't like my odds in an anarcho-primitivist purge scenario. We have this way of producing goods and providing things to people that, 1, gives people some of the things that they want, and 2, allows people who occupy a certain position in society the ability to make fat stacks of the backs of other people's labour. I suppose that's the same as it ever was, but it allows a different kind of person to do that, and it gives them the structure to embed that power. And as we've progressed from this point, we've had a cumulative problem. That is, the CO2 that was pumped into the atmosphere all the way back in the 19th century is still there. And we've been pumping out more and more every year. So part of the answer to how we got here is going to be that it's profitable for emissions to keep rising, or at least that it has been for a long time. And as long as it remains profitable, the incentive will never be there for the economic activities of those who make the profit to change. Take, for example, solar power. It's one of the cheapest sources of energy available to us now. I accept you can't run a society off solar power alone. I mean, I live in the UK. I know that there are more than a few days where we'll have less sunlight than the ideal amount. If it's cheaper, surely that's what we should be doing. In fact, most renewables are now lower in cost than non-renewables by almost any metric, and yet we're not really moving fast enough. And this leads on to something else that comes up a lot in the how we got here discourse, even though it's much more recent. A lot of people fall into the trap of saying, why are we, that is, people in the West, having to address this, when other countries outside the West are now polluting more? It's easy to forget because we tend to think of emissions as a year-by-year thing, that with graphs like this one on the screen, it's not just where the line is currently that matters. It's important where the line is currently because it tells us where the issues may be, but as my friend Ponderful pointed out, a lot of the emissions in the global south, and in particular in China, are because we've just moved our production there. It's the area under the graph we need to be worried about, and well, if you check out the excellent Kurzgesagt video on it, you can see the percentages. But the US and EU, which in most data sets includes the UK, don't shoot the messenger, it's just how this particular data is usually collected, are responsible for almost 50% of historic emissions. And we should bear in mind that while a lot of countries in the EU have reduced their share of the current emissions, you can still see countries like Germany and the UK produce as much in emissions as entire continents do today. And that's without considering our outsourced production. So, you know, there's probably more than a little bit of work to be done here as well. To put it bluntly, it's not looking very good right now. There's a pretty dumb line of thinking that puts us on individual consumer choices, as if we can reusable bag our way out of this crisis. I'm not going to come out and say, don't bother, because if it keeps environmental issues on your mind, I think that's good. There's a reason why, if you're watching this, your personal choices are irrelevant. It's the economic activities of the very richest in the world that's driving emissions. Here's a quote from the report that assessed the emissions from different wealth categories.
The richest 10% accounted for over half of the emissions added to the atmosphere between 1990 and 2015. The richest 1% were responsible for 15% of emissions during this time, more than all the citizens of the EU and more than twice that of the poorest half of humanity.
Check out this graph, which shows the projected impact of COVID-19 when compared to where our emissions were trending before against what we needed to do to maximize our chance of keeping the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Even with lockdowns, the economic downturn, and a lot of policies and personal choices that would have reduced CO2 emissions, we didn't match the necessary trajectory to maximize our chance of keeping the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. To put it in the mildest possible terms, it looks like we're royally fucked.
Why did we get here?
When we're considering the question of why we got here, it's important for us to acknowledge that it's been an unfortunately long path from the first understanding and theorizing around how changes in CO2 in our atmosphere may impact our environment and climate change, becoming a political issue that commands people's attention. Part of it is that science itself can be a rather small c conservative institution, and sounding the alarm isn't something that scientists actually enjoy doing, especially when the alarm you're sounding is the holy shit the world is literally on fire alarm. So the fact that we've got to the point where scientists are sounding that alarm should, have alarmed us probably about 50 years ago. So if scientists are sounding the alarm, or at least pointing in a direction that even got noted demon and dead woman Margaret Thatcher to pay attention to it, why has seemingly nothing been done, especially by governments like hers, which actually created the conditions for the climate crisis to get worse? Yes, that's right, her decision to close the coal mines weren't some great green revolution before green politics went mainstream. They were a way to break the power of trade unions. The UK still imported a fuck ton of coal, a process which actually meant more carbon emissions. So fuck anyone trying to paint her and her callous decision as any kind of green achievement or her as a green hero. Fuck you. It's not unique to particularly right-wing governments either, but the transition to neoliberalism didn't do anything to slow down emissions, nor would it. That's because the state's interests are aligned with that of extractive capitalists, and well, extractive capitalists love to extract resources and use them for profit. So here we are, living in a world where dead dinosaurs and plants are powering too much of our economy. And part of the reason why we're in this position is because of outright denial by successive governments across the world. In fact, to this day, you have governments led by explicit climate change deniers or with members who are. Perhaps the worst one of these, given the unfortunate geographic reality of the area that's under their control, is Jair Bolsonaro, a man who just looks so spectacularly unhealthy that I can't believe he's still alive, who happens to be in charge of the country that has most of the Amazon rainforest in it, which, because of human activity, has become a net emitter of CO2, which is fucking brilliant. I love that fact. It doesn't depress me at all. Fuck. A more common form of denialism these days is a kind of soft denialism. My friend John Duncan actually did a very good video going into this, but to quickly summarize what this looks like, imagine a person who says, yes, of course human activity causes climate change, but who refuses to support anything actually meaningful that would deal with it. They might say nice things, or support politicians who say things like, we'll be net neutral by 2050, which is just way too fucking late. This refusal to confront the sheer scale of the issue before us, perhaps waiting for a magic technology to save us or for geoengineering to buy us time, which we will get to, is tantamount to denial and should be treated as such. One of the other reasons we've got to this place is simply because we prioritize certain types of growth over others. All of us have kind of become obsessed with GDP. Even people who promote objectively good, or at least better things, like Green New Deals or Green Industrial Revolutions, they always have to caveat their sound environmental arguments around growth, which is fine, I suppose, as a political argument. And I'm not here to make an argument about degrowth, since it's a little outside of my wheelhouse. It just strikes me as interesting that we've decided that these metrics that are decoupled from the quality of our lives should be constraining and determining the policy proposals to tackle the climate crisis. By all means, have green manufacturing, have free public transport for all, and all of the good things, but perhaps we're missing a trick not measuring the quality of our lives over something like the economy. I'm not a fully automated luxury communism guy, despite, all of this. But maybe we could do some of the more interesting and good parts of that idea if we pursued some kind of heavily planned series of measures to totally transform our economy. I don't know, I'm an optimist at heart. That's why this video is so hard for me to just get through.
Is it too late?
This is the tough part. Is it too late? Well, let's hope not, but let's take a look at this graph. So what we have here is a series of paths that we could plausibly, take to reduce our CO2 emissions to zero. Each one offers us a different probability of remaining below 1.5 degrees of warming, which is pretty important for reasons we're going to get into. The earlier we get to net zero, the higher our chances of doing that. And, well, it basically comes down to which set of dice you feel comfortable rolling. But let's be honest, we're not exactly on a political path to doing this quickly or correctly. To put it bluntly, 1.5 degrees of warming is still not great. We will have more frequent extreme weather events, and there will still be climate refugees created by the pressures of the changing climate. That being said, going above 1.5 degrees Celsius warming is a total fucking disaster waiting to happen. You'd likely see mass extinction at 2 degrees Celsius that begins to impact ecosystems in a way that means that their use to us as humans is reduced. It's crude and a bad argument for preserving the environment, and it's not exactly respectful of it, but I don't really have much to offer in that regard right now. There's also the issue of freshwater. Yes, 1.5 degrees Celsius will put some pressure on this, but 2 degrees will really start to turn the cool zone dial up. There will be a loss of farmland, permafrost melting, which releases our good friend methane into the atmosphere. You could see regions where billions of people live become uninhabitable for large parts of the year. I mean, we're pretty much at the point where we'll be having a lot of climate refugees. So we should probably get on to dismantling that fortress Europe and actually pushing for open borders. But that might be a topic for another time. One of the things we're certainly going to try is geoengineering. You've probably seen some of these projects floated in the news. This headline, I don't know where the headline's going to be, refers to a plan to use wind-powered pumps to spray water over the Arctic in order to refreeze it and increase the albedo of the Earth. Which, I mean, it's certainly a plan, or a particular favourite of certain people is the idea of putting aerosols or particles in the air in order to prevent the sun's radiation from reaching the surface in the first place and being radiated back out as infrared. Setting aside some of the anxiety that causes me, given mass atmospheric meddling hasn't exactly gone well for us in the past, I'm not convinced by it. Kurzgesagt did a great video about this, but to summarize it, you can think of it as like the climate change solution in Futurama. You put a giant ice cube in the ocean to cool the Earth, you keep eating a bigger and bigger ice cube, and suddenly you're out of ice and the planet is burning. The hard truth is, we can maximize our chance of 1.5 degrees warming, but there will be pain, both economic in the short and medium term and the consequences of our historic emissions. Our focus should be on doing everything in our power to maximize that chance, and a lot of things will need to be involved in that. Technology sharing and debt forgiveness for the global south so that those countries can have access to the technologies that will allow them to develop in a less carbon intensive way, and so that they're no longer bound by large debts owed largely to former colonial powers. In fact, reparations will also likely need to be a component of this, not just because it's right, which it is, but because if we're to make the systematic changes necessary to meet our obligations and prevent this kind of reckless behavior again, we need to reckon fully with our past. We also need to realize that net neutral from countries like the UK isn't going to be enough. We need to become carbon sinks or net negative, because other countries will necessarily take time to reach net zero, and we can actually meaningfully buy time for them by becoming net negative. What's one way we could do this? Well, we could plant trees. If only someone had thought of that. The question of whether it's too late really boils down to too late to do what? There are a lot of potential outcomes on the table, ranging from Venus to Mad Max to Bad Actually to Bad But Livable and perhaps with time repairable. We don't have to suffer through a total societal breakdown, and it's up to us on the left to make our case now and make it urgently, because eco-fascists and worse are already making their case. building walls, hardening border regimes, and militarizing them. People often make the mistake of saying we haven't prepared for climate change, and to an extent, we haven't. But we've certainly prepared for some of the consequences because of right-wing hegemony and the solutions they have, which are fucking awful. Anyway, I think we should wrap this up before I end up making any of you feel even worse than I probably already have.
Concluding thoughts.
My main thought as I come to the end of this, to be honest, quite harrowing video for me, is that we've got here through a series of choices. We choose to live within certain systems and limits, and it's not our personal consumption that's going to make the difference here. We can avoid some of the worst potential consequences, but it means we have to face the challenge as it is, not as we wish it was. Hair in my face in front of my glasses. I'm not a fan of it. I would love for my decision to use a metal straw to be the difference between 2.5 degrees Celsius warming and 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. But it's not. And neither is your decision to do that if you choose to do it. And yes, by the way, I know that a mojito is meant to be in a Collins glass. I don't own a Collins glass. That's why I have stuff like a Patreon. And a job, to be fair. But you know, we know whose economic activity is causing this crisis. We know the name of the system that enables them to do this. Capitalism. So perhaps we ought to start dealing with that in whatever ways we have to hand from the local level upwards and fight like our lives depend on it, because it just might. I want to thank the people who proofread this script, my partner who is having to deal with me being like this today, so you know, a real hero if there ever was one. An old friend of mine from university who is also cursed with the knowledge of physics. I'm not sure if he wanted me to name him or not, but he knows who he is. He's going to be sent this video, and he is one of my oldest friends that I still have, so glad that he puts up with me after all these years. And of course, I want to thank Mick Wright, who both proofread the script and provided his voice for the section titles. And I also want to thank the Neon Lady who provided her voice for this, my good friend N Participation who provided their voice for this, and my other good friend Mr. Gump who provided his voice for this. You can find links for all of their good stuff down below in the description. So apparently some people think this is worth paying for, like all of this, and to those 3 people so far, I say thank you so much. As their names will be appearing somewhere, I don't know, let's say there, put their names on that wall, just, you know, really bold so everyone can see them. But a special thanks to Sarah and Drone Riff, who, as members of the top tier on my Patreon, get this special shout out. Cheers, I hope you two are having a wonderful time. And everyone else, well, hope you've enjoyed this video as much as you could. And I will catch you next time.